I need to keep working on my report in which we are looking to see if poverty is a mediator between high school and violent crime. That is, can poverty explain why there's a relationship of high school graduation rate to violent crime rate? So we began working through the steps, and the first step in showing that there's a mediator is to show that the explanatory variable is related to the response variable, and we did that. That's what we did right here. Here was the regression model. About 20% of the variation in violent crime rates can be accounted for or associated with high school graduation rates. Now, the next step in the process is to show that the explanatory variable is related to the mediator or potential mediator. So we're really looking at this little arrow right here. That is, can we say that high school graduation is related to poverty? Now, these arrows indicate potential cause, but the first thing you need to do is to be able to show that they're related. So let's go ahead and create another code chunk. And I'm going to copy in. I have already created the commands so that I could just copy it in and you wouldn't have to watch me type it in. Here it is. Notice I'm regressing poverty on high school here. And so when we do that, we find, in fact, that the coefficient of determination is 0.59. We have a stable model. The p-value is almost 0. That's e to the minus 11. That's a lot of zeros in there before we see any non-zero digits. And we see, of course, the same thing here for the high school graduation rate as a coefficient, because this is a simple linear regression model, and so those two p-values are going to be the same. And remember that back when we did the original correlations, that there was a strong correlation of high school to poverty. So this is not surprising. We knew that that correlation existed. It's just we've taken it a step further now so that we can actually create a model. And I have written some text about this model. Let me go ahead and copy that in. As the next step towards studying poverty as a mediator, I created a regression model to predict the poverty rate from the high school graduation rate. Here's the model. Let me go ahead and put poverty under a hat to show that we're estimating it. And this should create for us a nice little centered formula here. In fact, I don't think I did it that way up here. And let me go ahead. This is the double dollar signs instead of the single dollar sign. The single dollar sign does it more inline code. That is, it keeps it where it is. But the double dollar sign creates it on its own line and centers it. So, okay, so this tells us for every % increase in the high school graduation rate, the poverty rate is reduced an average of 0.6 percentage points. This model can account for almost 60% of the variation in poverty rates across the states. High school graduation rate is a stable predictor. We have p less than 0.01, and of course, this is a bit redundant because it's simple linear regression, but I'm going to keep it in there because in a moment we're going to do multiple linear regression. The model has value in other years if 2005 is a representative year. So we've taken now the first two steps to show that the explanatory variable is related to the response and to show that the explanatory variable's related to the mediator. Now we want to see if we add poverty to the model with high school, whether that model predicts not only the response, but also to see how it influences the explanatory variable when we put poverty in the model. Remember back up here, we had negative 21.5 was our coefficient for explaining violent crime via high school or by high school, and we had a 0.001 indicating a stable coefficient. If poverty is a strong mediator, what I expect to happen is that this estimate for high school, that coefficient will actually go down, that it will not have as much of an effect. And in fact, it may even go down so far as to make this p-value high, because poverty then is taking over in that chain that we have here. So high school is related to poverty, but now if we put poverty in, is it related to violent crime above and beyond what we get with the high school graduation rate? That's what we want to know. So let's go ahead and put in another code chunk here and create that model. And again, I have written some code for this. Okay, so a couple things catch my eye right off the bat here. The coefficient of determination hardly changed at all. That catches my eye. I note that poverty is very unstable, has a really high p-value here. So that estimate of -3 relative to the standard error, notice that it's about a fourth of the standard error. By contrast, the high school coefficient didn't change much at all. If we go back up here and look, that was -21.5, and now it's -23. And you might say, well, it even got stronger, except that, yes, it did. The estimate got bigger, but so did the standard error got bigger. So our p-value actually went up a little bit. But this is not what I expect to see if poverty is a good mediator. I would expect to see the p-value be low for poverty. I'd expect to see the p-value go up substantially for high school. I'd expect to see the estimate for high school drop. And when I say drop, I'm talking about in absolute value terms. The magnitude of the number, regardless of sign, I would expect to see that drop. So right now, it does not look like poverty's much of a mediator. The other thing we could do is look at the partial and semi-partials of high school and violent crime, that is the explanatory and the response, after controlling for poverty. And if poverty was a strong mediator, we would expect to see that correlation drop near zero. So let's go ahead and calculate those as well to further explore this. That tells us something about the strength of the mediation. It's possible that high school has both an indirect effect on violent crime through poverty and a direct effect that would remain after removing poverty. So that's why I'm going ahead and exploring this. So let me put this in. Let me put in a couple more models here. I'm going to put in a model in which we take poverty out of violent crime. That is the response variable. And let me make another model. I'll call this model 5, in which I take poverty out of high school. So if I look at the residuals of these two models, it will be the correlation of high school with violent crime after removing poverty. And so let's go ahead and see what those partial correlations look like. Let me, I need to put in the correlation functions as well. Let me do that, and I'm going to do it both on squared and squared. And so when I run those, these are the partial correlations. So I notice that this one is -0.33. That's the correlation of high school with violent crime after accounting for poverty. So it's a partial correlation, 0.33. If I go back up to the original correlations, I notice that it has come down a little. It was minus 0.45, and now it's dropped to minus 0.33. So poverty taken out of both the violent crime and high school has dropped the correlation a bit. So there may be a little bit of mediation going on, but not a whole lot. And in fact, we have a partial squared of about 0.11, indicating that we're accounting from high school with poverty removed, we're accounting for about 11% of the variation of violent crime with poverty removed. So that's kind of, you could think of it as holding poverty constant and then seeing what this looks like. Let's go ahead and get the semi-partial squared as well. So I need another code chunk. And this time I only need to take poverty out of the high school, out of the explanatory variable. So I'm going to take poverty out of high school. That's model 5 here. And so my correlation, let me go ahead actually and copy these because I can just then alter them. My correlation is going to be of the violent crime rate with the residuals after taking poverty out of high school. And this will then be the semi-partial. Notice that residuals are only taken out of the explanatory variable, not taken out of the response, which is why we call it a semi-partial or a part. And so let me go ahead and look at that. And our semi-partial correlation is minus 0.31. And we have about 0.10. That means that we can account for about 10% of the variation in violent crime with high school after we've already removed poverty from high school. So the partial is just a slightly bigger number. And remember that partial is looking at only the residual for violent crime after removing poverty and saying how much of that can you explain, whereas this semi-partial is looking at all of the violent crime variation, the violent crime variation, and looking to see that we can explain 10% of the whole thing with the high school after removing poverty. And that compares to back up here when we looked at high school without removing poverty, we were accounting for twice as much, or 20%. So this is not a strong mediator. There may be a little bit of mediation going on that we're seeing here, but not a strong mediator. So let's write this up. I'm going to go ahead and create some text and then copy it in. So here is some text. I say there is not much evidence that poverty is a strong mediator in explaining the relation of high school graduation rate to the violent crime rate. The coefficient for high school graduation rate in the regression model with poverty is similar to what it is without poverty in the model. The partial correlation of high school graduation rate and violent crime rate after removing the influence of poverty from both variables is negative 0.33. That's what we saw right up here. A small reduction from the correlation of negative 0.45 among these two variables when the influence of poverty is not removed. The semi-partial correlation is negative 0.31. That's what we see right here, when poverty is only removed from the high school graduation rate. And the square of this, right here, indicates that high school graduation rate can explain 10% of the variation in violent crime rates that remain after counting for poverty. By itself, the high school graduation rate can explain 20% of the variation in crime rates. That came from back up here at our first model that we created, this coefficient determination of 0.20. Thus, there is some validity to viewing poverty as a partial mediating variable, but it also suggests other, perhaps better explanations remain for the association of high school graduation rate and the violent crime rate. Okay, I am ready for my conclusions and a press release, and then I need to clean everything up. So here are some conclusions. I examined whether the high school graduation rate can explain the violent crime rate. I further explored the sociological notion that high school graduation rates influence poverty rates, they do, such that poverty can be considered a mediator for the high school and crime relationship. The answer to this last question is that it is only a partial mediator. In fact, although the amount of variation in the violent crime rate that is explained by high school graduation is reduced from 20% to 10%, need put in to this to tell the R markdown that percent should be treated, and I didn't do it up here too, treated as a percent sign and not a special character, is reduced from 20% to 10% after accounting for poverty. The high school graduation rate remains a stable predictor of the violent crime rate. With or without poverty in the model, a 1 percentage point increase in the high school graduation rate is associated with about 22 less incidents of violent crime per 100,000 people. And now a press release. University of South Carolina researchers recently studied data from 2005 to determine if high school graduation rates in a state can help explain the violent crime rate from the state. In fact, 20% of the variation in violent crime rates across states can be explained by the high school graduation rate. We also studied a model proposed by sociologists that what is most important here is that high school graduation rates influence poverty rates, so that poverty is the actual underlying cause of violent crime, said Michael Seaman, lead researcher for this study. While it is true that high school graduation rates appear to have a profound effect on poverty rates, these underlying causes or these graduation rates can still explain the variation in violent crime rates even after accounting for poverty. I believe there are deeper underlying causes to violent crime than whether one graduates from high school or not, but we will need to study other sociological models to determine what those factors might be. Seaman did not speculate about these other factors. The full report on this research will appear in the May issue of the, I need to italicize it, Journal of Statistical Findings of Research from Southeastern Colleges and Universities. Okay, that's a fictitious journal as far as I know, but there's our report. Now we got to clean it up a little bit. Let's make sure we cut off the code chunks that should be cut off. That would include this one. This one I don't want to show anything. Okay, so that one's done already. Then this one, don't want to show anything. Same here. Same here. And if I ever wanted to run this, note that I can get my correlations out here in the console window. And let's go ahead and make this one code chunk here. Get rid of this one. Okay, let's knit it and see how it looks. Okay, I think it's good to go. So that's my report. I'm finished with it, and this also finishes this video series. I look forward to working with you in the next video series.